At the UN Climate Summit watched by thousands, Leonardo DiCaprio said into the microphone, "These young activists are too idealistic, they don't understand the real world." Standing across from him, 19-year-old Autumn Peltier smiled calmly. When she opened the folder in her hands, the environmental research data that emerged would silence the Oscar-winning actor within 30 seconds and cause the biggest embarrassment of his career. No one expected such an intellectual destruction. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss these incredible moments. The Assembly Hall of the United Nations headquarters in New York was preparing for a historic moment. The final day of the 2025 UN Climate Summit had brought together the world's most influential climate change advocates. Under golden lights, delegates, activists, and celebrities from 193 countries had taken their seats for the final session. Leonardo DiCaprio, at 50 years old, stepped onto the stage as one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces. As a UN Goodwill Ambassador, DiCaprio had been speaking about climate change for years and saw himself as an expert in this field. Approaching the podium in his Armani suit with that familiar confident posture, the Oscar-winning actor was also the founder of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, having donated millions of dollars to environmental causes. However, DiCaprio's climate activism had always remained at surface level. His world tours via private jets, yacht parties, and lifestyle contradicting his carbon footprint were constant subjects of criticism. That night when he stepped onto the stage, he again had his prepared speeches and political talking points, but lacked real scientific knowledge. Standing opposite him was a completely different force. Autumn Peltier, 19 years old, a young activist from the Anishinaabe First Nation in Canada. Having grown up with the clean water crisis of Indigenous communities from a young age, these experiences had made her a global water advocate. When she first participated in a water ceremony at age 8, she witnessed firsthand the harm contaminated water caused to her community. Peltier wasn't just an activist, she was also a scholar studying environmental science at the University of Toronto, specializing in water quality research. Serving as the youngest water commissioner at the UN, she was doing legal advocacy on environmental rights for Indigenous communities. The knowledge in her hands was a unique combination of personal experience and academic training. That night when Autumn Peltier stepped onto the stage, she wore a professional business suit instead of traditional Indigenous outfit. In her hand was a thick research folder, containing years of water quality data, climate impact studies, and first-hand evidence collected from Indigenous communities. This folder was the powerful weapon that would destroy DiCaprio's surface-level celebrity activism. The topic of the summit was Indigenous communities and climate justice. DiCaprio was invited to the panel as a celebrity advocate, while Peltier was there to represent the Indigenous perspective. Moderator Maria Santos, an experienced UN diplomat, thought this evening would go smoothly. No one expected such an intellectual battle between a Hollywood star and a young Indigenous activist, and the audience were world leaders, environmental scientists, media representatives, and young climate activists. The live broadcast was being watched by millions on CNN, BBC, and social media platforms. This setting was DiCaprio's comfort zone: spotlight, cameras, applause. He had prepared the environmental talking points he could confidently discuss. Peltier, however, was there with a different energy. In Indigenous tradition, showing respect to elders is important, but truth-telling is even more important. Her ancestors had protected the land and water for hundreds of years. Now she carried this responsibility. The combination of scientific data and traditional knowledge made her unique. Before the panel began, there had been a brief conversation backstage. DiCaprio had friendly asked, "Hey kiddo. Excited to be here?" Peltier had responded respectfully but confidently, "Yes, sir. I have important information to share tonight." DiCaprio hadn't seen the documentation in Peltier's folder at that time. When the lights dimmed, moderator Santos introduced the panel. Tonight we have Leonardo DiCaprio, Academy Award winner and environmental advocate, alongside Autumn Peltier, Indigenous water advocate and UN Water Commissioner. Applause thundered through the hall. DiCaprio waved, Peltier respectfully nodded. The first question came to DiCaprio: "What's your message to young climate activists?" It was a perfect setup question. DiCaprio took his microphone, started speaking with a confident smile. "I've been in this fight for decades," he said. "Young people are passionate, which is beautiful, but word was going to change everything. But young activists are too idealistic, They don't understand the real world, DiCaprio continued, his tone becoming patronizing. Climate change is a complex issue. Through my Hollywood experience, I've seen many different perspectives. This young generation thinks about going viral on social media, not actual science. Uncomfortable murmurs began in the audience. A few young activists had shock expressions on their faces. DiCaprio continued without noticing, I appreciate young activists like Autumn, of course. But real environmental leadership requires mature perspective. Autumn Peltier smiled calmly at that moment. The cameras caught this expression, a confident, knowing smile. She began to open the folder in her hands, but hadn't yet shown what was inside. DiCaprio's monologue continued, unaware of the approaching disaster. Look, I've worked with real environmental scientists, real policymakers, DiCaprio continued. These young activists, they read some articles online, attend a few protests, and think they're experts. But actual environmental work requires connections, funding, Hollywood influence like mine. Moderator Santos, sensing tension, tried to redirect, Mr. DiCaprio, what specific environmental projects are you most proud of? DiCaprio seized the opportunity. My foundation has donated over $100 million. I've produced documentaries, spoken at countless events. This is how real change happens, through established systems, not through naive idealism. Autumn Peltier quietly opened her folder completely. Inside were hundreds of pages, scientific research, water quality reports, climate data from indigenous communities, legal documents, and photographic evidence. Her academic training had taught her patience. Her indigenous culture had taught her to listen before speaking. DiCaprio, feeling confident with audience applause, decided to address Peltier directly. Autumn, you're very young, very passionate. That's admirable. But environmental science isn't something you learn from. Where did you learn about climate change? Social media? School projects? The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably. Peltier remained calm, but her eyes intensified. She had been preparing for this moment her entire young life. Mr. DiCaprio, Peltier began, her voice steady and respectful, thank you for that question. I'd be happy to share where I learned about climate change and environmental science. She stood up slowly, folder in hand. The room's energy shifted palpably. DiCaprio still had that confident smile, expecting a typical young activist's emotional response about caring for the planet. I learned about climate change when I was 8 years old, Peltier continued, when my community's water became undrinkable due to industrial pollution. I learned about environmental science when my grandmother taught me traditional ecological knowledge that my people have practiced for thousands of years. DiCaprio's smile began to waver slightly. This wasn't the response he expected. But let me be more specific, since you asked about my qualifications. Peltier opened her folder and pulled out the first document. I'm currently completing my environmental science degree at University of Toronto, with specialization in freshwater ecosystems and climate impact assessment. She held up an official university transcript. My current GPA is 3.97. My research has been published in 3 peer-reviewed journals focusing on indigenous water rights and climate adaptation strategies. The audience was now completely focused on her. DiCaprio looked confused. This wasn't fitting his narrative about naive young activists. Peltier pulled out another document. This is my appointment letter as the youngest water commissioner in UN history. I was selected based on my research work and advocacy experience, not social media presence. She pulled out a thick research report. This is my 200-page analysis of water quality degradation in 47 indigenous communities across North America, with detailed scientific measurements, chemical analysis, and climate correlation data. DiCaprio tried to interrupt. Well, that's impressive for someone your age, but real environmental work requires what, Mr. DiCaprio? Peltier cut him off politely but firmly. Let me share what real environmental work looks like in my community. She pulled out photographs. These are images from my reserve showing water contamination levels over the past decade. Each image is accompanied by scientific data I personally collected using EPA-approved testing equipment. The photos appeared on the large screens behind them. Shocking images of polluted water, dead fish, contaminated soil. The audience gasped. This research represents 400 hours of fieldwork, 200 interviews with community members, and collaboration with environmental scientists from 3 universities, Peltier continued. DiCaprio's confident demeanor was cracking. He hadn't expected this level of scientific rigor from someone he had dismissed as a naive activist. Furthermore, Peltier pulled out more documents. I've testified before Canadian Parliament twice, contributed to U.S. congressional hearings on environmental justice, and my water protection advocacy has resulted in 3 successful legal challenges against polluting industries. The room was completely silent now. Every eye was on Peltier as she systematically destroyed DiCaprio's assumptions. So when you ask where I learned about environmental science, Mr. DiCaprio, the answer is, from living it, studying it, researching it, and fighting for it every single day of my life. She paused, then delivered the line that would go viral. I learned environmental science not from Hollywood scripts, but from watching my people die from contaminated water. The silence in the hall was deafening. DiCaprio's expression had completely changed. Confidence had given way to visible discomfort. Autumn Peltier wasn't finished yet. The most devastating part was coming now. Mr. DiCaprio, may I ask you a question about environmental expertise? Peltier's tone was respectful but authoritative. How much of the $100 million your foundation donated went directly to Indigenous communities? DiCaprio stuttered, well, we support various organizations that… I'm asking for a specific number, Peltier interrupted gently. Because Indigenous communities are the populations most affected by global climate change. According to my research, your foundation allocated only 2% of its total donations to Indigenous-led environmental projects. She pulled out another document from her folder. These are the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation's public tax records. The breakdown of your donations from 2020 to 2024. Out of $100 million, only $2.1 million reached Indigenous communities. Shocked murmurs rose in the audience. DiCaprio had become visibly uncomfortable. Those numbers. That's not. We support many organizations that indirectly. Peltier's eyebrows raised. Mr. DiCaprio, environmental justice is about direct action, direct support. Indigenous peoples protect 80% of the world's biodiversity despite being only 5% of the global population. How can you claim environmental leadership while ignoring the communities most effective at conservation? This statistic exploded like a bomb. Environmental scientists in the audience began nodding. Everyone knew this fact, but no one challenged celebrities this way. Peltier pulled out another document. Speaking of conservation effectiveness, this is an analysis of deforestation rates in the Amazon rainforest. The deforestation rate on indigenous protected lands is 0.08%, while areas protected by governments and international organizations show 0.43%. Charts appeared on the screen. The numbers were undeniable. Your foundation supports several rainforest protection projects, but none of them are Indigenous-led, despite Indigenous communities being 5 times more effective at forest protection. Peltier continued methodically. DiCaprio desperately tried to counterattack. Look, young lady, these are complex international issues. You can't just throw statistics around without understanding political realities. Political realities. Peltier's voice took a slight edge. Let me show you political realities, Mr. DiCaprio. She pulled out a thick legal document. This is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Article 29 clearly states Indigenous peoples' right to a clean environment. Article 32 requires consultation on projects affecting Indigenous lands. Of the 23 environmental projects your foundation supports, 19 affect Indigenous lands, but only 3 conducted proper consultation with Indigenous communities, she presented the data. Uncomfortable shifting increased in the audience. No one expected this level of detailed research from a young activist. DiCaprio became increasingly defensive. We work within existing systems. We can't revolutionize everything overnight. Existing systems. Peltier smiled sadly. Mr. DiCaprio, those existing systems created this climate crisis. Indigenous communities have had sustainable environmental practices for thousands of years. Maybe it's time to listen to us instead of talking over us. She prepared for the most devastating blow. Besides, speaking of existing systems, shall we discuss your personal carbon footprint? DiCaprio's face went pale. He always avoided this topic. Peltier pulled out another research document. According to publicly available flight records, private jet usage, yacht activities, your personal annual carbon footprint is approximately 1,700 tons of CO2. The average American, 16 tons. The average Indigenous person in my community, 3 tons. The numbers were displayed on screen. The contrast was shocking. In 1 year, your lifestyle produces as much carbon as 100 people in my community produce in 10 years, Peltier stated calmly. DiCaprio tried damage control. I offset those emissions through my foundation work. Do you? Peltier pulled out a carbon offset analysis. Your claimed offsets include several tree planting projects that haven't been independently verified, questionable carbon credit purchases, and theoretical future reductions. Actual verified offsets cover approximately 23% of your carbon footprint. That means you're still producing 1,300 tons of net CO2 annually while lecturing others about climate responsibility. Some people in the audience started slow clapping. This level of accountability rarely happened to celebrities. Peltier prepared the final scientific blow. Most importantly, Mr. DiCaprio, let's discuss actual climate science knowledge. You mentioned young activists don't understand real science. Can you explain the relationship between ocean acidification and indigenous fishing communities? DiCaprio looked blank. He couldn't handle this specific scientific question. Can you define climate justice beyond general talking points? Peltier continued. What's the difference between climate adaptation and climate mitigation strategies for vulnerable populations? DiCaprio's silence was deafening. He could recite general environmental buzzwords, but specific scientific concepts were unknown territory. Mr. DiCaprio, Peltier's voice softened but remained powerful. I respect your passion for the environment. But passion without knowledge, action without consultation, advocacy without accountability, that's not environmental leadership. That's environmental tourism. She pulled out a final document. This is an invitation. My community would welcome you to visit, learn about real environmental challenges, see actual impacts of climate change, and understand how indigenous traditional knowledge combines with modern science for effective solutions. Come learn from us instead of talking about us. Experience environmental reality instead of environmental celebrity. The room erupted in sustained applause. DiCaprio sat there, thoroughly outclassed, outresearched, and exposed. The remaining time of the panel was spent with Autumn Peltier dominating. DiCaprio made a few more weak attempts to recover his credibility, but each time he was silenced by Peltier's factual responses. Moderator Maria Santos tried to maintain professional composure, but couldn't hide her astonishment at the intellectual destruction that had clearly been witnessed. When the panel ended, the audience gave a standing ovation, but the applause was for Peltier, not DiCaprio. The Hollywood star tried to make a quick exit, but couldn't escape the media scrum. Reporters shouted questions. Mr. DiCaprio, how do you respond to Ms. Peltier's carbon footprint analysis? Will you visit indigenous communities as she suggested? Do you plan to change your foundation's funding priorities? DiCaprio's answers were weak and defensive. I respect different perspectives. We'll review our strategies. Young voices are important. They consisted of standard political non-responses. Meanwhile, Peltier calmly and composedly gave detailed answers to media questions. Environmental journalists were impressed by the depth of her knowledge. Climate scientists in the audience approached her to discuss collaboration opportunities. The social media explosion was immediate. #AutumnDestroysLeonardo began trending worldwide within 30 minutes. Clips went viral on every platform. Peltier's carbon footprint comparison moment got 50 million views in the first 24 hours. The environmental tourism quote became a meme template. Her research presentation gifs were shared with, "When you come prepared" captions. Traditional media coverage was equally devastating for DiCaprio. CNN headline. Young Indigenous activist schools Hollywood star on climate science. BBC. University student exposes celebrity environmental hypocrisy. New York Times op-ed. When passion meets preparation. A lesson in environmental advocacy. Environmental organizations' response was swift. Greenpeace tweeted, "This is what environmental leadership looks like." Research. Accountability. Community connection. Sierra Club. Autumn Peltier demonstrates why indigenous voices must lead climate solutions. 350.org. Young activists aren't naive, they're informed. prepared, and fighting for their future. Academic institutions took notice. Harvard environmental law professor, masterclass in environmental justice advocacy, MIT Climate Science Department, exemplary integration of traditional knowledge and modern science, Stanford environmental program invited Peltier for a guest lecture. But the most significant impact was in indigenous communities. Peltier's performance inspired thousands of young indigenous activists globally. Social media flooded with traditional knowledge sharing, community environmental projects took the spotlight, and indigenous-led environmental organizations experienced a donation surge. DiCaprio's team went into damage control mode immediately. Within 48 hours, the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation announced a $10 million special fund for indigenous environmental projects. DiCaprio posted a carefully crafted social media statement acknowledging learning opportunities. His PR team scheduled visits to indigenous communities, though these were criticized as obvious photo-op moves. However, the damage to his environmental credibility was substantial. Several upcoming speaking engagements were cancelled. Environmental documentary projects reconsidered his involvement. The UN quietly distanced itself from his ambassador role. Peltier's career, conversely, skyrocketed. University of Toronto offered her a full PhD scholarship with an expedited program. The UN invited her to a permanent advisory position on climate policy. Netflix approached her about a documentary deal on indigenous environmental leadership. TED Talk invitation, with 2025's most anticipated speaking slot. The long-term implications for the environmental movement were profound. Knowledge over celebrity. The movement shifted focus from celebrity advocates to actual experts. Indigenous leadership. Recognition grew that indigenous communities should lead environmental discourse. Accountability standards. Environmental advocates faced increased scrutiny regarding their personal practices. Youth expertise. The stereotype about naive young activists was completely shattered. Educational institutions worldwide began using Peltier's performance as a case study. Law schools. Environmental justice advocacy techniques. Environmental science programs. Effective data presentation. Communication studies. Respectful but powerful confrontation methods. Indigenous studies. Traditional knowledge integration with modern science. 6 months later, the impact was still reverberating. DiCaprio quietly stepped back from major environmental advocacy. His foundation, while increasing indigenous funding, never recovered its previous influence. He returned to acting focus. His environmental profile significantly diminished. Peltier became a leading voice in the global environmental movement. Her approach, combining rigorous science, traditional knowledge, and respectful but uncompromising advocacy, became the model for a new generation of environmental leaders. Most importantly, indigenous environmental projects received unprecedented attention and funding. Her 10-minute performance had accomplished what decades of traditional advocacy couldn't: mainstream recognition of indigenous communities' central role in environmental protection. 1 year after the panel, Peltier gave a major climate policy speech at the UN. DiCaprio wasn't in the audience, but his influence was everywhere. Research standards had risen, accountability expectations had increased, and the environmental movement had become more inclusive and effective. Autumn Peltier had proven that real environmental leadership comes not from fame or fortune, but from knowledge, community connection, and unwavering commitment to truth. Her folder of research had changed not just one panel discussion, but the entire environmental discourse. That night in New York, a 19-year-old indigenous activist hadn't just defeated a 50-year-old Hollywood star, she had redefined the future of environmental advocacy. If you enjoyed this incredible story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Share in the comments. What do you think about environmental leadership? In the next video, we'll break down other powerful confrontations.